Episode 135 The Rise of the Prank Queen. The morning sun filters through the labyrinth's impossible windows, casting patterns of light that shifted between realities with each passing moment. But today, something different hummed through the castle's corridors, an electric anticipation that made even the stone walls seem to hold their breath. Today was the day that Jade Alexandra Anderson, Nexus Queen and beloved center of an impossible family, would claim a new title that her recent tutoring sessions with certain masters of mischief had prepared her to assume. At 27 years old, Jade had spent 8 years building this extraordinary household, 8 years learning to balance cosmic responsibilities with intimate family moments, 8 years discovering that love could indeed transcend every conventional boundary when pursued with absolute dedication. But recently, she had been engaging in what could only be described as intensive graduate studies in the ancient and revered art of chaos creation. Her primary instructors had been a rather spectacular collection of mischief makers. Loki, the god of mischief himself, had provided theoretical frameworks and advanced magical techniques for creating elaborate illusions that would make even the most skeptical observer question their grip on reality. Michelangelo, her turtle brother whose recent apprenticeship with Loki had produced genuinely impressive results, had contributed his natural creativity and his instinctive understanding of comedic timing that years of pranking his own brothers had refined into something approaching supernatural intuition. Deadpool had offered what he called his masterclass in breaking the fourth wall and people's expectations simultaneously, which mostly involved increasingly absurd suggestions delivered with such absolute confidence that distinguishing genuine advice from elaborate jokes became an intellectual exercise requiring capabilities Jade wasn't entirely certain she possessed. And perhaps most significantly, the dream demon Freddy Krueger had taught her some truly diabolical applications of reality manipulation that his unique perspective on fear and surprise had made devastatingly effective when repurposed for comedic rather than horrific outcomes. The planning had taken weeks, the preparation had required coordination that rivaled some of their more serious multiversal interventions, and the execution would demand perfect timing, flawless magical control, and absolutely zero mercy for anyone's dignity regardless of their accumulated power, or their characteristic composure that normal circumstances allowed them to maintain without serious challenge. Jade stood in what had been designated as Prank Central, a secure room that Tony Stark's technology and Stephen Strange's mystical warts had rendered completely undetectable to the various enhanced senses and sophisticated monitoring systems that the household's security-conscious members maintained for exactly these kinds of situations, despite their paranoia proving entirely justified given what she was about to unleash. Her co-conspirators had assembled with expressions ranging from Loki's aristocratic anticipation, through Michelangelo's barely contained glee, through Deadpool's manic enthusiasm that his mask could not adequately conceal. Nathan, James, and Gabe had positioned their cameras throughout the castle at strategic angles that Jade had carefully selected to ensure maximum documentation coverage while maintaining the element of surprise that the prank's effectiveness absolutely required. The content creators were practically vibrating with excitement about the footage they were about to capture, recognizing that this would be perhaps the single greatest episode in their channel's history, despite the considerable competition that 8 years of documenting impossible family dynamics had produced. Jade's voice carried absolute authority when she addressed her assembled team, commander preparing troops for battle, except the battle involved whoopee cushions rather than actual weapons, and the casualties would be measured in damaged pride rather than physical injury. She added, "Everyone, we have planned this operation with precision that would make military strategists weep with envy. Every family member has been assigned at least one unique prank calibrated specifically to their personality and their particular vulnerabilities. The magical frameworks are in place. The mundane props have been positioned. The cameras are rolling. And most importantly, we have committed absolutely to the bit, regardless of whatever consequences our collective dignity will suffer when inevitable retaliation occurs." She paused for dramatic effect, her royal blue cloak of levitation adjusting itself in what might have been the magical equivalent of cracking knuckles in preparation. "Today, we declare prank war. Today, no one is safe. Today, I claim my crown as a prank queen. And let history record that we went down swinging, even if we go down hard when 55 extremely powerful individuals coordinate their revenge." Loki's voice carried his characteristic theatrical delivery. "A stirring speech, my dear Nexus Queen, though I feel compelled to note that I am technically providing assistance rather than being a target myself, yes?" Jade's smile was absolutely wicked. "Oh, Loki, sweet summer god. Everyone is a target. Everyone. Including and especially those who helped plan this glorious chaos." The god of mischief's expression cycled rapidly through several emotions before settling on something approaching resigned admiration. "I have taught you too well." "You really have," Jade confirmed cheerfully. "Now let's begin." The first wave of pranks activated simultaneously across the castle through magical triggers that Loki and Jade had spent days carefully positioning and calibrating. The effects were immediate and spectacular. In the potions laboratory that Severus Snape considered his personal sanctuary, his characteristic black robes suddenly shifted to a vibrant neon pink that clashed spectacularly with everything in the dungeon aesthetic space he had carefully cultivated. But that was merely the opening salvo. When he opened his mouth to express his undoubtedly scathing opinion about this affront to his dignity, his voice emerged as a high-pitched squeak that helium inhalation might produce if helium possessed a particularly malicious sense of humor. The cameras caught Snape's face, cycling through approximately 17 different shades of the outraged crimson as he attempted to articulate his fury through a voice that made him sound like an indignant chipmunk. His hands moved through gestures that were probably attempting to cast counterspells, but the magical framework Jade had established was specifically designed to resist exactly that response, requiring him to actually track down the source, rather than just overwhelming the prank through superior power. But the pièce de résistance came when he turned toward his carefully organized potions ingredients and discovered that every single jar had been enchanted to sing. Not just any songs, but specifically the most annoying earworms that muggle popular music had ever inflicted upon human consciousness. His flobberworm mucus was belting out Baby Shark. His bicorn horn was passionately performing the song that never ends, and his precious viewers were harmonizing on It's a Small World with enthusiasm that suggested they had been waiting their entire existence for this exact opportunity. Snape's sputtering, indignant rage was absolutely magnificent to behold, his helium voice only amplifying the comedic effect as he attempted to maintain his characteristic stern demeanor while being serenaded by his own laboratory supplies and looking like he had raided a fairy princess's wardrobe. Elsewhere in the castle, Loki discovered that his own carefully curated wardrobe had betrayed him spectacularly. Every article of clothing he owned had transformed into various shades of pink, from his usually dignified black and green Asgardian leathers to his casual earth clothing to his formal robes that state occasions required. The God of Mischief stood in his chambers, staring at his reflection with an expression that suggested he was experiencing profound existential crisis about whether his own signature techniques being deployed against him with such devastating effectiveness represented poetic justice or just deeply offensive personal attack. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried that distinctive blend of offended dignity and barely suppressed appreciation for the craft involved. Well played, my student. Well played indeed. Though I feel compelled to note that this declaration of war will necessitate a response of proportional creativity, and my accumulated centuries of experience may provide certain advantages that your enthusiasm and your recent instruction cannot quite match despite your obvious natural talent. The magical monitoring system Jade had established captured his expression, shifting from outrage into something approaching dangerous contemplation, as he clearly began planning revenge, though it undoubtedly be spectacular. She made mental note to sleep with one eye open for the foreseeable future. Tony Stark's prank activated when he entered his workshop and attempted to provide his usual stream of sarcastic commentary about whatever project currently consumed his genius attention. But instead of his characteristic witty observations, his mouth began producing completely unrelated movie quotes delivered with perfect timing, but absolutely zero contextual relevance to anything he was actually trying to communicate. "I'll be back," he announced to Pepper while clearly attempting to discuss quarterly financial reports. "You can't handle the truth. Show me the money." His bewildered expression that his own mouth betrayed him was absolutely priceless. Genius inventor clearly attempting to diagnose the mechanism while simultaneously being forced to communicate exclusively through cinema's greatest hits. "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker," he added, apparently trying to express frustration about a situation, but being limited to what the prank's parameters permitted. Pepper's expression suggested she was torn between concern and barely suppressed laughter as Tony continued his involuntary movie marathon. "May the force be with you. I'm the king of the world. Here's looking at you, kid." The weapons room experienced mass transformation that would haunt its usual occupants for weeks to come. Every sword, every dagger, every staff, and every projectile weapon had been replaced with rubber squeaky toy versions that maintained perfect visual fidelity to their original forms, but that produced comically inappropriate sounds when deployed. Raphael's sigh squeaked like dog toys when he grabbed them for morning practice. Steve's shield produced a rubber duck squeak every time he positioned it for throwing. Wolverine's claws emerged with a sound like someone stepping on a dozen squeaky toys simultaneously. The confusion and the dawning horror on their faces as they discovered the transformation was absolutely magnificent. Logan's growled, "What the hell?" was punctuated by another round of squeaking as his claws retracted. Raphael's immediate shouted, "Mikey," suggested he had correctly identified at least one of the responsible parties, despite being completely wrong about this being purely his brother's work. And Steve's exasperated sigh carried the weight of a man who had definitely experienced elaborate pranks before, but who had perhaps hoped his superhero career would involve more dignity than rubber squeaky weapons. Freddy Krueger discovered his predicament when he attempted to manifest dramatically from the shadows for his characteristic theatrical entrance, and found himself abruptly stuck to the ceiling, with his gravity apparently having decided to operate in completely the wrong direction. His voice emerged as the same helium-enhanced squeak that Snape was suffering, creating the deeply undignified spectacle of legendary Nightmare Demon dangling from the ceiling and squeaking indignantly about the profound disrespect this represented. "Get me down from here," he squeaked, his razor glove waving ineffectually. "This is not scary. This is not intimidating. This is the exact opposite of my entire aesthetic." The Dream Demon's protest only intensified when Robert Englund entered and discovered his own prank. The legendary actor found himself sparkling like a twilight vampire, his skin emitting the distinctive glittery shimmer that the film franchise had made infamous. His expression as he examined his sparkling hands suggested he was processing multiple emotions simultaneously, from bewildered amusement through theatrical horror, through grudging appreciation for the cultural reference that his Hollywood background made particularly pointed. "Really?" he asked the ceiling, presumably addressing whatever cosmic forces had allowed this indignity. "We're doing the sparkly vampire thing? I've played Freddy Krueger for decades, and this is what my legacy gets reduced to?" Willie experienced his pang during breakfast when he suddenly found himself gently floating toward the ceiling, while his skin shifted to a vibrant blue that made him look like he had guest starred in a science fiction film with questionable makeup budget decisions. His gentle confusion as he drifted upward was somehow more endearing than alarming, the kind visitor clearly attempting to understand the physics involved, rather than being immediately distressed about his sudden vertical mobility. "This is most unusual," he observed mildly while rotating slowly. "I do not recall Earth's gravity typically operating with this degree of selectivity." Edgar Allan Poe discovered his dramatically dark aesthetic had been undermined when his carefully maintained black hair transformed into bubblegum pink that would not have looked out of place in an anime convention. His horrified expression as he caught his reflection suggested that assaulting his gothic sensibilities represented perhaps the cruelest possible prank for someone whose entire brand involved brooding darkness and melancholic shadows. Doctor Strange's cloak of levitation developed sudden overwhelming attachment issues, wrapping around him with such enthusiastic affection that movement became genuinely difficult. Every attempt to peel it off resulted in tighter hugging. The sentient magical artifact apparently having been convinced that its master desperately needed constant physical contact regardless of his protests about personal space and dignity. His attempts to use his sling ring for his cape proved equally futile when the portals began redirecting to increasingly absurd locations. Trying to portal to his sanctum landed him in the castle's bathroom. Attempting to reach the library deposited him in the kitchen, and his frustrated effort to just portal literally anywhere else opened directly into the children's playroom, where he materialized to the delighted squeals of toddlers who immediately began using the Sorcerer Supreme as a climbing structure. "This is not how dimensional travel should function," he announced with intellectual annoyance, while small children scaled in like a jungle gym. "The mystical principles governing portal formation are being flagrantly violated." Snape's laboratory suffered an additional indignity when he discovered that every available surface had been plastered with enlarged photographs of unspeakable space, making the silliest possible expressions. His already squeaky protests reached new octaves of outrage as he beheld his professional workspace transformed into a shrine to someone else's lack of dignity. Auril discovered that his ancient vampire eloquence had been compromised when every sentence he attempted to speak ended with the word banana, regardless of context or his attempts to prevent the addition. "I find the situation most disturbing, Banana," he announced with as much dignity as possible. "Such disrespect toward one of the Volturi elders is unprecedented, Banana." Fred, the redeemed nightmare entity, found himself unable to stop performing the Macarena despite his absolute lack of desire to engage in such activity. His body moved through the dance's distinctive choreography on endless loop, his expression suggesting he was experiencing existential crisis about whether this represented worse indignity than his actual nightmare existence had involved. "Make it stop," he pleaded while his arms continued their involuntary movements. "I will accept any punishment, endure any suffering, if someone will just make this stop." Victor discovered that sitting down anywhere triggered an air horn sound effect of such volume and suddenness that his ancient vampire composure shattered repeatedly throughout the day. His mounting frustration as he attempted to find somewhere, anywhere, to sit without announcing his presence to the entire castle with explosive sound was genuinely hilarious to witness. But the grand finale of the first wave came when Tony Stark's Iron Man armor suddenly activated without his input and began assembling itself around the nearest person, who happened to be a very surprised and increasingly indignant Severus Snape. The potion's master's squeaky protests reached unprecedented levels as mechanical components attached themselves with smooth precision, ignoring his flailing attempts to escape. "Get this muggle contraption off me," he squeaked while the suit continued its assembly. "I am not some common," the faceplate closed, cutting off his protests as the fully assembled Iron Man armor stood in the middle of the corridor containing one very displeased wizard, whose pink robes were now completely hidden beneath red and gold metal. The armor speakers activated, projecting Snape's helium voice with perfect clarity. "I demand immediate reversal of this preposterous situation. I am head of Slytherin House, not some mechanical puppet." Tony, still speaking exclusively in movie quotes, managed to convey his bewildered amusement through his limited vocabulary. "I have a bad feeling about this. Houston, we have a problem. Hasta la vista, baby." The second wave of pranks deployed throughout the afternoon involved more classic physical comedy that magical innovation had perhaps overshadowed, but that remained devastatingly effective when properly executed. Kylo Ren opened a storage cabinet and was immediately buried under approximately 3,000 ping pong balls that the confined space should not have possibly contained. His force-enhanced reflexes proved entirely useless against the sheer volume of small bouncing spheres that continued pouring out for what seemed like minutes. His mounting frustration evident in the increasingly aggressive force pushes he deployed to clear his immediate area, only to be overwhelmed again by the seemingly endless supply. Jared rounded a corner with his characteristic theatrical flair and walked face first into perfectly positioned sarin wrap that his magical awareness had completely failed to detect, despite his accumulated centuries of experience with illusions and misdirection. His offended dignity as he peeled transparent plastic from his face was absolutely magnificent, the Goblin King clearly struggling to maintain his regal bearing while dealing with perhaps the most mundane prank in human history, successfully deployed against a divine person. "This is beneath my station," he announced while still removing plastic wrap from his hair. "I am an immortal being of considerable power, not some victim of mortal mischief involving household products." Bucky Barnes experienced the classic pie-in-the-face treatment when he opened what he believed was a secure weapons cabinet, the spring-loaded mechanism delivering a cream pie with precision that his enhanced reflexes somehow failed to avoid. His expression as he stood with whipped cream dripping from his face suggested he was processing whether his dignity or his reputation as a dangerous operative had suffered more damage. Steve Rogers, attempting to help his friend, opened an adjacent cabinet and received his own pie delivery. The super soldiers, now standing together in matching cream-covered confusion that undermined approximately 70 years of combined badass reputation. The feather bomb that Wolverine triggered filled an entire corridor with white feathers, and his previous encounter with the Zerg trap made incredibly adherent to his person. His grumpy confusion as he attempted to remove feathers from his hair, his clothes, and his inadvertently extended claws created the image of perhaps the world's least threatening and most ridiculous Wolverine that nature had ever produced. Palpatine's theatrical entrance to the dining room was somewhat undermined when the jump scare mechanism activated, a spring-loaded boxing glove emerging from unexpected angle and catching the former Emperor directly in his admittedly dramatic face. His outrage shriek was everything Jade could have hoped for, ancient Sith Lord's dignity completely forgotten as he stumbled backward while clutching his nose. "I was the Senate," he bellowed, his characteristic political authority somewhat diminished by his undignified sprawl. "I commanded armies, I manipulated galactic events, and you hit me with a boxing glove on a spring." The dry noodle back crack prank that Natasha fell victim to was perhaps particularly cruel given her spy training and her characteristic paranoia about potential threats. When Jade innocently offered to help with the sore muscle and then snapped a piece of uncooked pasta while pressing on her back, the Black Widow's instant panic about spinal injury was genuinely concerning for approximately 3 seconds before she realized what had actually occurred. Her flat, dangerous stare suggested that revenge would be creative, thorough, and probably terrifying when it eventually materialized. "You're lucky I love you," she said with zero humor in her voice. "That's the only reason you're still breathing." As the day progressed into evening, the accumulated chaos reached truly magnificent proportions. The castle had become a war zone where no location was safe, where every corridor might contain some new indignity, where opening any door or touching any object represented genuine risk to one's dignity and composure. Leonardo was coordinating with his brothers to attempt systematic identification of all prank mechanisms when he walked directly into another saran wrap trap that Michelangelo's insider knowledge about his brother's tactical patterns had positioned with devastating accuracy. The leader's exasperated sigh as he dealt with plastic wrap was accompanied by Mikey's barely suppressed laughter from somewhere nearby. "I know that's you, Mikey," Leonardo called out while removing transparent plastic, "and I know Jade was involved, and I'm fairly certain Loki provided technical assistance. Just know that we will be having words about appropriate family conduct and respecting each other's dignity." "Your face was worth it," Mikey's voice floated from somewhere. "So worth it." Qui-Gon Jinn attempted to use his Jedi serenity to ignore the whoopee cushion that someone had placed on his meditation mat, but the effect on his dignified bearing was still absolutely devastating. His raised eyebrow as the cushion produced its characteristic sound suggested he was questioning his life choices that had led to being pranked by people he had generally considered to be mature adults, capable of restraint. Obi-Wan's encounter with the bucket of water over the door trap was made particularly spectacular by his attempt to use the Force to stop the falling water, succeeding only in suspending the bucket itself, while the water continued its descent with physics-defying determination thanks to Loki's magical interference. His spluttering indignation was beautifully Jedi-like in its measured disappointment. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles found their various weapons had been replaced with pool noodles, the flimsy foam tubes providing exactly zero tactical utility but maximum comedic value as they attempted their practice forms, only to have their movements accompanied by the gentle whooshing sound of ineffectual foam rather than their usual deadly precision. The Raphael's immediate assumption that Michelangelo was solely responsible proved incorrect when Mikey appeared equally victimized. All 4 brothers, standing in confused solidarity while holding colorful pool noodles and trying to maintain their martial arts badassery despite circumstances that made such bearing impossible. Master Splinter discovered that someone had replaced his tea with apple juice, the sensei's disappointed expression suggesting that disrespecting his tea ceremony represented perhaps the deepest possible offense against his dignity and his cultural practices. His quiet, "I'm not angry, merely disappointed," somehow felt worse than any amount of rage would have been. The YouTubers Nathan, James, and Gabe found their cameras had been modified to add various ridiculous filters to their footage, puppy ears, and rainbow vomit and flower crowns appearing on everyone they filmed regardless of attempts to disable the effects. Their protests about content quality were somewhat undercut by their own barely suppressed laughter at the results. Tony finally regained his normal speech patterns around dinner time, his first non-movie quote statements being an emphatic, "Okay, I've analyzed the magical signature and the technological integration, and I have to admit this was genuinely impressive work. Infuriating and completely undignified, but technically impressive." Stephen Strange managed to separate himself from his overly affectionate cloak, only to discover that someone had enchanted his sanctum to play Never Gonna Give You Up on endless loop, the Sorcerer Supreme's intellectual annoyance reaching new heights as he realized he had been recalled through mystical means. This is an abuse of magical principles for juvenile purposes, he announced to no one in particular. The Ancient One would be deeply disappointed in all of us. Jared had recovered his composure from the Saran Wrap incident, only to discover that his carefully styled hair had been enchanted to change colors every 30 seconds. The Goblin King's theatrical aesthetic completely undermined by his head cycling through rainbow hues like a malfunctioning disco ball. His performative delight at the effect convinced absolutely no one, but his commitment to maintaining entertainment value even while being victimized was genuinely impressive. Well, I suppose it does add a certain avant-garde flair to my appearance, he announced while his hair shifted from purple to orange. Very contemporary. The grand finale of the entire day's chaos came during dinner when every single family member who had been pranked throughout the day arrived at the table to discover place cards that had been enchanted to announce their most embarrassing moment from the day in enthusiastic voices. Welcome Severus Snape, who spent 4 hours speaking in helium voice while wearing pink robes, his card announced cheerfully. Please be seated Loki Odinson, god of mischief, who discovered that pink is very much his color. Greetings Robert Englund, sparkly vampire extraordinaire. The accumulated indignation as 50+ voices simultaneously protested their respective announcements was absolutely magnificent, a symphony of offended dignity that no composer could have adequately orchestrated, but that spontaneous coordination produced with perfect comedic timing. Jade stood at the head of the table with her co-conspirators beside her, all of them wearing matching Prank Queen t-shirts that Tony had apparently fabricated during his brief possession by movie quotes. Her smile was absolutely unrepentant as she surveyed the assembled chaos she had created. I want to thank everyone for their participation in today's festivities, she announced with formal dignity, completely inappropriate to the situation. Your reactions have been documented for posterity and will live forever on multiple YouTube channels with millions of subscribers. The footage of Snape in the Iron Man suit alone will probably go viral across multiple dimensions. Snape's glare suggested that his revenge would be creative, thorough, and probably involve potion ingredients that she didn't want to think too carefully about. Loki's expression promised mystical retaliation of proportional creativity, and approximately 45 other faces showed varying degrees of plotting that suggested the next few weeks would involve looking over her shoulder constantly. But Jade regretted nothing. This was exactly the kind of absurd, undignified, completely unnecessary chaos that made their impossible family beautiful. Yes, they saved realities and fought cosmic threats, and maintained complex polyamorous dynamics that conventional wisdom insisted should collapse. But they also pranked each other mercilessly, maintained their sense of humor through impossible circumstances, and refused to take themselves so seriously that joy became impossible. Taboo stood and raised his glass in toast, his masked eyepieces conveying his grin. To Jade, the Prank Queen, who today proved that power and dignity are no defense against whoopee cushions and rubber squeaky weapons, may her reign be long and may our revenges be swift. The toast was echoed around the table with varying degrees of enthusiasm and underlying threat, but everyone drank. Because despite the chaos and the indignity and the absolute destruction of everyone's composure, this was family. Chosen family that had been built through years of sustained choice and mutual investment, and absolute commitment to each other's complete well-being, including their need for laughter and absurdity and moments of pure, ridiculous joy. The cleanup would take days, the revenge plotting would take weeks, and the stories would last forever, passed down through the family's generations as legendary tales of the day the Prank Queen rose and no one's dignity survived intact. But in that moment, surrounded by 55 partners and 15 children and the most ridiculous collection of pranked heroes and reformed villains that any reality had ever assembled, Jade felt nothing but absolute contentment. This was her family. This was her crown. And she would wear it with pride even when the inevitable retaliation arrived. Welcome to understanding that families built on love could also be built on elaborate pranks and mutual chaos. Welcome to recognition that dignity represented a small price to pay for genuine joy and shared laughter. Welcome to knowledge that sometimes the best way to honor powerful beings was reminding them they were human, or turtle, or god, or vampire, but always fundamentally silly creatures capable of experiencing delight, even through their own temporary humiliation. The Prank Queen had risen, the chaos had been glorious, and somewhere in the impossible castle between realities, the beautiful mess of their family had been enriched by a day of complete undignified absurdity that no one would ever forget, no matter how hard they tried. Long live the Queen, and may everyone else sleep with one eye open. Episode 136. The Sparring Session. The morning sun filtered through the labyrinth's impossible windows, casting patterns of light that shifted between realities with each passing moment. A lingering scent of whipped cream and a faint echo of Rick Astley still hung in the air, remnants of yesterday's spectacularly chaotic prank war orchestrated by Jade. But today, a new energy pulsed through the castle, a challenge laid down that promised a different kind of exhilarating chaos. Raphael, the hot-headed turtle of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, stood in the central training chamber, his sash gleaming under the enchanted light fixtures. He hadn't fully recovered from being pied in the face, the lingering sweetness a constant reminder of the Prank Queen's reign. But the humiliation hadn't dampened his competitive spirit. It had merely focused it into a sharp, challenging point. Certain clothing set a project for Boris, I'm bone, the reinforced walls. I've been sizing you guys up, and frankly, I'm not convinced any of you can actually keep up.